So let's get started. I'm going to kick us off with just some quick housekeeping and notes about our presentation tonight, and then I'll hand it over to STEM4Real to kick us off. So I'm Aurora Dreger from the Educating All Learners Alliance, and welcome to today's webinar, Connecting and Supporting Learning for Assessment Success All Year for All Learners, hosted by the Educating All Learners Alliance, or ELA for short, and STEM4Real. So we've got a couple of quick housekeeping items. We can all enjoy today's presentation. And if you're watching it back on the recording, these are always just good Zoom webinar tips to keep in mind. Identify yourself when speaking. Saying your name before you speak helps participants who can't see the screen follow along with the conversation. We're going to use the chat and the question and answer function, so feel free to ask questions or add comments during the presentation. And also use the drop-down menu to directly message the hosts and panelists if you don't want your question to be seen by all. Closed caption has been enabled for this meeting, and you can turn your captions on and off by clicking on the box that says CC in your control bar. You can also drag and drop the box that contains the captions to anywhere you want on your screen. You may have noticed that we're recording this session, so it can be shared on ELA's YouTube page and referenced in the future, but sensitive information or personal stories will be edited out before sharing the final recording. And there will be links, emails, resources, all kinds of good stuff shared in the chat. And after the webinar, we'll send out that information in an email to all participants and registrants. So don't feel like you need to hurriedly take notes unless that's your thing, unless you want to. So before we dive into today's content, I'll share some information about ELA. We are a coalition of organizations dedicated to producing and sharing resources, programs, and events just like this, dedicated to supporting students with disabilities and learning differences. And your presenters today are Dr. Jennifer Munoz and Marie Gorman from STEM4Real. I'll be monitoring the chat and assisting with any Q&As in the webinar. And with that, I'll pass it over to Jennifer and Marie to start today's presentation.
Thank you, Aurora. It's so good to be here. And thank you all for showing up to our webinar. A little bit about STEM4Real before we get started. We're a young nonprofit. We're just getting out of the toddler years. We turned 4 at the beginning of this year. And we're a nonprofit committed to making STEM for real. So regardless of a student's backgrounds or their learning abilities, we believe that everyone should have STEM, a rigorous and equitable access to STEM. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and get started with our presentation. We're your facilitators. I'm Marie, and I'm the Director of Operations for STEM4Real. I was a teacher in the Pacific before I jumped on the STEM4Real team, and here's my colleague, Jennifer.
Thank you, Marie. Welcome, everyone, wherever you are in the world and whatever time of day it is for you when you're watching this. I am also a former science educator and have been working with STEM4Real for the last year, and I'm excited to be sharing this information with you all.
Who is this presentation for? This presentation is for teachers, parents, instructional aides who would like to know more about the key areas of focus for the CAST. So specifically in this presentation, we're going to be talking about the California Science Test, but this can apply to all states and your science assessments as well. And we're going to be looking at some of the core scientific concepts and practices that you should be aware of as an advocate for your students. And in this presentation, we're going to be exploring instructional strategies and resources that support learning and achievement on the CAST, not just during the exam itself, but throughout the school year.
All right, and our outcomes for this webinar are to really think about how families and communities and educators can discover commonalities around advocating for students. It is currently testing season, so it is a time of disruption with regular schedules, which can be difficult for families, especially for students with disabilities. And so as advocates for all learners and supporting students, we want to consider preparing for this time of year. And if you're just now thinking about how to prepare for testing right now, it's kind of too late. So we want to think about next year. So when we're preparing our students for, this April, May window of testing season, the students are not noticing this big disruption. They've already been prepared and prepped for this season. And so we're going to cover sort of thinking about what kind of questions we need to ask about testing. What are the different strengths that students bring to test taking? And then different techniques to support test taking. So we'll look at this idea of considering, the test is the whole year. We're preparing students right from the get-go and beginning in September so that during testing season, it's a more positive experience for students.
Before we jump on, I know if you want to drop into the chat your role in education and introduce yourself a little bit. We've talked a little bit about STEM4Real and some of Jennifer's and my background. So in the chat, please take the time to just introduce yourself and let us know what you're hoping to get out of the presentation as well. All right, so why do we have standardized testing? What is this? So when we think about our students of disabilities, especially our elementary students where in a classroom, all the subjects are taught in one area, our elementary students with disabilities tend to be tracked away from pursuing these advanced academic endeavors. So a lot of times in order for our students with disabilities to get extra assistance, they're often pulled out of the classroom. And by being pulled out from the general classroom, they're not getting the time to have these fun subjects like science, which they're all entitled to have. So essentially, we're hiding our students with disabilities from general education and getting this STEM education that they deserve. So now thinking about how our students with disabilities, and we're pulling them out of the classroom, but yet they still have to take the standardized testing like everyone else. So this is an activity that we do with our teachers where we ask them to just write on a Post-it or on a Jamboard what they've heard about students with disabilities. So I just want you to take a few minutes and read some of these comments, and some of the comments are very painful to hear, especially if you're just a passionate teacher and you work with students with disabilities and you know that this isn't true, but you may hear about these things or you may have some of these implicit biases within you when it comes to our students with disabilities. So what do you think? After reading some of these Post-its, how do these make you feel? Like one of the Post-its that stands out to me is this blue Post-it right here. They can't do STEM since they don't have the basic academics. They need to focus on foundational skills. We need to dumb things down so they can get some of the content. That's right. So when we're reading these comments, it's very deficient based, and we're not looking at the strengths with our students with disabilities. So knowing these are some of the misconceptions about our students with disabilities, they're entering this standardized testing with these misconceptions. Did you want to add anything, Jennifer, about this slide?
No, I think it's very telling. And with STEM4Real, what we do is we want to create this safe space for educators to number one, become aware of these biases. That's sort of the first step, is like in a safe space, being able to really express sort of the culture that exists within the system of how students with disabilities are seen as incapable of taking any sort of science academic course. And so then we work with that bias, and then we look at all of the opportunities for students. So we really flip that script. And so that's our purpose, is then to really strategically set goals and learning targets for all students so that they're able to access science, technology, engineering, mathematics in an equitable way. And why does that matter? It's because, we have a little bit of data to go on. Now, granted, this was from this past academic year, which was sort of fraught with all kinds of other issues, right? Ongoing pandemic, learning loss, chronic absenteeism, high turnover in schools. And so we're seeing some pretty dire numbers. So when we look at just science and we think about in California, the percent of students within each achievement level, overall, we see that only 29% of students met or exceeded the standard for science. And what's interesting, I just read a report today, the future skills needed for the workforce, those entering the workforce, number one was analytical thinking. And so if we just, think about science as a skill to analyze evidence and think through evidence and create evidence-based claims, right now we're only seeing 29% of students are able to meet those standards. And then when we look at students with disabilities, we're seeing only 8% of students are meeting or exceeding those standards for science. And so we'd really like you to consider this as like a bigger problem that we could tackle. I'm all for small change, right? Small changes add up to the larger, more systemic change. And so if we were to break down, standardized testing in general, and this is a really nice infographic to think about the different assessments that students have an opportunity to demonstrate their learning and the months of the year where these testing windows open. And so you'll see that the California Science Test, so the CAST, actually opens up in January. And they have the opportunity to take that test through June or July, depending on their academic school year. But students with disabilities also have an opportunity to take what's called the California Alternate Assessment. And so if you look at that window, that actually opens up in September. Now, the California Alternate Assessment is designed for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities, and it's based on a different set of standards that are similar to NGSS. These standards are called the NGSS connectors, and we actually have a link. I can drop that in the chat. And these are really, really helpful. It is a very lengthy, wordy document, but for educators, it is very, very helpful because it shows how students with disabilities can connect with those performance expectations at grade level or below grade level. So let's say you have a third grade student that perhaps needs a little bit of help with first or second grade standards in order to get to that third grade standard. So this document would help the instructor, the educator, work with that student on those NGSS connectors to get them to those skills that are going to be tested on the California Alternate Assessment. And so we'd like to really think about how to really support these students for real. Like, let's get real. How can we do this? A couple of considerations as well, in addition to looking at those standards, is to think about access to information. And we don't want students to be introduced to complex texts and performance expectations just during testing season. We want access to information all year long. So we want to consider, students may not have grade level text readily available to them. So how can we get access to this information? We also want to consider students who do not speak English, so our multilingual learners. How can we get translatable text? And also, one other key area, which I think is really exciting, students who are multilingual learners can use a scribe during testing season. And so what that looks like is a student would explain orally their explanation in science, and the scribe would write down the answer for them in English and submit the answer on the California alternate assessment. This is also available for the cast. And so it would be just good practice to start this in September. Explain to me your thinking. Why do you think that? And then have someone scribe for that student. And so this process becomes innate in their learning. Another area to take into consideration, and with STEM4Real, we like to work with our teachers in this area. We spend a lot of time creating three-dimensional 5E lessons. And one of the outcomes of this practice is personalized learning. So we can create personalized lessons, built-in accommodations for the students, make any modifications that are necessary for students to access the learning, as well as demonstrate their learning in a variety of ways. So we build in a lot of choice. We like to think about culturally responsive practices. How can we access students' passions and interests to really ignite excitement and engagement within the content area?
So here's, go ahead. No, go ahead, Jennifer.
No, go ahead.
So an example is, for example, here we use ChatGPT to pull up some recommendations for accommodations and modifications. So if you have a student with ADHD, some accommodations can be providing a quiet, distraction-free environment for the students. You can also have some of those fidget toys to help them, take some of their attention away while you're talking or giving directions, and making sure that your transitions in the classroom are smooth and slow. So students with ADHD have trouble with the transitions, and that can cause a lot of internal turmoil for them. So making sure that you're giving them slow, you're having an agenda that they can follow along throughout the day, and giving them heads up. So in 15 minutes, we're going to do this activity now. So giving them that heads up so the transitions aren't so difficult. And another thing that we like to do, especially when reading aloud with our students, is having the options of having audiobooks and assistive technology. So all of this taking advantage of the technology that we have before us. And really thinking about individualized learning for every student. And in our lesson plan template that Jennifer had mentioned, we like to make sure there's a column specifically for accommodations and modifications, so that as teachers are planning their lessons, they're intentionally thinking about these accommodations and modifications for students with disabilities, and really for all students.
And so just like Marie was mentioning, we want to promote inclusivity and really highlight culturally responsive teaching. And so we like to center student identity in each lesson. And a great way to find resources, and we've had a lot of success with teachers to really help them see the value in planning and taking this extra step, is building in ChatGPT, like AI. It's making life more efficient, and we're able to spend the time on other things. So we can use ChatGPT to really connect the context of a student's particular culture or lived experience. Like, for example, we wanted to share with you connecting photosynthesis to food deserts. So this is an example. So we looked at ChatGPT. How can I connect photosynthesis to food deserts? So this would be like a 5th grade NGSS performance expectation, but food deserts are culturally relevant to any person living in an urban environment. So we've got some culturally responsive connections that we can make between food deserts where people are relying on highly processed foods that are typically very dense in calories, high in sugar, fat laden, but they're lacking in a lot of vitamins and minerals. So we see that this leads to health problems, diabetes, and heart disease. And so that is the problem that we're trying to address. And by building in a lesson on photosynthesis, we can really shift the conversation to getting students engaged in community gardening and creating these examples of how photosynthesis can be used to address food deserts by growing our own food and having access to fresh and healthy food on a regular basis. And so by connecting these two seemingly disparate topics, we really emphasize the importance of equitable access to food and nutritious diets for all people.
And another thing we can do to support our students is making sure that we're encouraging those academic discussions and collaboration. And so this means that you're allowing students to discuss their understanding of science between themselves. There's no greater teacher than your peer. And so we want to make sure that, especially with our students with disabilities and our multi-language learners, that we're not just sticking, they're not working with the same partner all year long, but giving them that option to be able to work with diverse students in your classroom and just allowing that collaboration and discourse to take place. And so we've been using a lot of Chat GPT examples just because AI is sort of the buzzword when it comes in education right now, and it just makes things a little bit easier. But when it comes to really building these culturally responsive lessons, the first step is really getting to know your students, right? Because as much as, for example, we like to use Chat GPT and it'll generate a lot of great examples about prompts for academic discussions and photosynthesis and food deserts, for example, if we know our students really well, we can craft these discussion prompts that really gets them talking. So, but if we do get stuck, we can use tools like Chat GPT to get us thinking. So an example of a good prompt that might get our students talking is, how can photosynthesis be utilized to address food deserts? And what are some potential benefits and challenges of implementing urban agriculture initiatives in these areas? So as you can probably see, it's a little bit of a mouthful. So you probably have to alter some of this language so that your students can understand it. During COVID, we were working with a teacher and she was discussing photosynthesis and food deserts. And this was a time when Minecraft was free online. I think it was Minecraft Earth. And she noticed that her students were really excited about the zombies. And so she was thinking about, oh, I can really link this to photosynthesis and food deserts, because what if I create this scenario in Minecraft or it's a food desert and students have to figure out a way using their using their zombies to survive. And so magically, they were, talking about photosynthesis and all of these ideas of building your own garden, really sparked students, thinking, and they were able to survive that scenario that the teacher had created. So it's about being creative and really crafting your discussion prompts so that students are curious and they want to be part of that discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Marie. I love that story. I hadn't heard that story before. I think it's, really the key to being a good educator too, is like listening to their conversations, right? Like we really want to think about what students want to talk about, and then when we're designing opportunities for that academic discourse, and then we're providing what we call that just-in-time vocabulary in science. Gone are the days when we're front-loading. We're not front-loading vocabulary words in science. We are providing academic vocabulary just in time. So, hey, I noticed that sand on the playground sort of washed down the hillside when it rained. That's called weathering. I'm so glad you noticed that and so now the students have an opportunity to put a name or an academic term on a phenomena that they've observed. So we're thinking about scaffolding those discussions and building in the just-in-time vocabulary for students. And so when we're thinking about students with who might have, say, ADHD, there's also, other considerations as well. So perhaps students want to get up and move their bodies and demonstrate learning in a kinesthetic way. So that could be another way to scaffold those discussions. And then we also want to think about this idea of self-directed learning. So the goal is that students become independent learners, and we know that it can be beneficial for students who have had, those traditional systems of support in school. And then it's empowering for students as well. We see that the brain-based learning and culturally relevant teaching practices build intellectual capacity as students are developing those executive functions in their frontal lobe. They're able to then take their learning in a self-directed way, and they have all of the tools and supports that they've been provided for them throughout the academic year. And then by the time it's time for test taking, they are just ready to go. They're ready to go on their own. And, when we're thinking about ChatGPT, again, sorry to bring this up one last time, I just think it's important. I've heard a lot of discussion around like cheating and finding answers, but it's really just an additional study tool, and learning how to ask the right questions and sort of treating it like a conversation, I think is really helpful for students. So that they can learn to ask questions, gather more evidence, think about things thoroughly, and then just have additional areas of support.
And I think just to add on to that, as teachers, we're the facilitators of learning now because of all the technology and resources that are available to students. We can't just present them information. We have to get them thinking because, like Jennifer said, we could use ChatGPT, we could Google it, they could probably find it on their social media. So we have to be a little bit more creative as teachers and look at ourselves as more as facilitators than giving out information.
Yeah. And so just thinking about if you are a teacher or an educator listening to this webinar, how can you support students all year long? And so these were some ideas that came from a group of educators. So if you want to take a moment and read through those, or if you're listening, some of the ideas were providing opportunities for group work, allowing students to use models in science. We use a lot of models, and so building in a lot of time for students to use models throughout their learning. Small group opportunities for those opportunities to discourse and practice their academic vocabulary. And then advocating for the test for real. So, the test is an opportunity, not something to dread, but it's something to look forward to. Now, look, you're going to be able to demonstrate everything you've learned throughout the school year on this test and reframe it in a positive way. So as a parent, there's a wonderful resource, and I'll drop it in the chat. Some things to help you prepare your child for testing. Some things to consider. Even myself, my son was testing this week, and I was thinking, oh my gosh, yes, I have to, we've got to get a good night's sleep tonight. We've got to have a nice dinner. We've got to, get up and make sure he has everything ready, water bottle, extra pencils, all of those things. But really talk to your students. Like, how are you feeling about your upcoming test? Is there anything I could do to support you? This is a wonderful guide. I'll drop the link in the chat for parents to support your student, your child. And then also know what are your child's strengths. And so this is a really wonderful infographic resources that are available to students during the California Science Test. Or what's really interesting to me when I first saw this, there are what are called universal tools. And so the universal tools are up in the upper left-hand corner, that box. The universal tools are what everybody has access to. So all students have the ability to take breaks. They have the ability to highlight key information as they're reading the text. They can access science tools and charts and things like that. But then there's also something called designated supports. So on the upper right-hand corner, thanks, Marie. These designated supports are also available to all students, but they have to be turned on by the teacher. So let's say, like me personally, Jennifer, I like my font to be a little bit bigger. My eyes are not so good, so I really would appreciate, bigger font. So as a parent, I could let the teacher know that, can we please provide some designated supports for my child during testing time? And what are those options? So text size, translation, even color contrast, if that's helpful for students, text to speech, those are designated supports available to all students. Now, the bottom in green, these are accommodations. So these are items that would have to be written into an IEP. So if you need any kind of embedded supports like American Sign Language or Braille or any very specific accommodation, that has to be written into the IEP. So just good to know, be in the know. What does your child need to take the test successfully? And then throughout the year, once again, throughout the year, consider ways to support students. So once again, those modeling, there is a free website called PHET, PHET. And this website is a great way to introduce students to modeling. These are digital models that students can play around with and get used to that type of technology. There are also these embedded supports that students can practice using throughout the year, such as annotating text. So whenever students are reading any kind of informational text, highlighting, words that they're key ideas, asking questions. Those are just good practices for students. And then mindfulness and relaxation techniques. So learning how to calm yourself, taking those 5 deep breaths are really, really helpful for students as they're walking into the testing room. They may feel a little bit of anxiety. So having those skills under their tool belt so that they know how to respond can really support students.
So in summary, we hope that throughout our presentation, you've learned how to understand what the test is, how to prepare your students for the test throughout the whole school year, and then during the testing itself, what are some strategies that you can use to make sure you're advocating for the students and they have the right resources to that Jennifer had mentioned, the universal versus those things that can be turned on by the teacher. And then just during the test itself, what can you do to help your students prepare? Here are the resources that we've used to create this presentation. And the next slide, I believe Ela is going to go ahead and send us the resources. So you'll find it in the slideshow as well.
And thank you, everybody. We really appreciate you listening and wish you lots of luck. If you have any questions or want to stay in touch, please reach out to us at our emails, Jennifer@STEM4Real.org or Marie@STEM4Real.org. And we'd really love for you to, if you could, take an exit ticket. And thank you, Rochelle.
Thank you so much, Marie and Jennifer, for that awesome presentation. This is Aurora from ELA. And so on behalf of ELA and STEM4Real, thank you to our participants, folks who are joining in live or watching the recording back. Thanks for joining us today. We dropped some links in the chat, and for our registrants, I will be sending all of that out to you in an email. If you are here with us still, we've got an ELA webinar survey that we would love for you to fill out if you get a chance. And that exit ticket from STEM4Real, I'll pop that in the chat one more time. You can check out all of this information, more events and resources at educatingalllearners.org. Follow us on Twitter, and also be sure to check out STEM4Real at their website, STEM4Real.org. Keep an eye out for that email, as I noted, with the links. And once again, thank you to STEM4Real for this fabulous presentation, and have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.